The heavy mahogany doors swung open, and the echo of polished Italian leather shoes filled the grand marble hall. The mansion's silence broke like glass, the kind that held memories and pride in equal measure. Richard Grant, billionaire industrialist and one of the most influential men in the world, had returned home earlier than expected. His face still carried the sharp lines carved by years of corporate wars, of boardroom battles fought under fluorescent lights and endless screens. His shoulders bore the invisible weight of empires built and defended, and his eyes, once burning with ambition, now glimmered with exhaustion. All he wanted that evening was silence, a glass of aged red wine, and the comfort of solitude. But what he saw the moment he stepped inside stopped him cold. Across the polished floor, in the study room lit by a golden chandelier, stood his maid Maria. She was dressed in the usual black and white uniform, but there was nothing ordinary about what she was doing. Her hand moved gracefully across a large whiteboard, writing complex mathematical equations, symbols and patterns that looked far too advanced for anyone outside an academic lecture hall. And sitting before her, cross-legged on a chair with a notebook in his lap, was Daniel, Richard's 7-year-old son, his small face lit with awe and curiosity. The maid wasn't cleaning, dusting, or vacuuming. She was teaching. No, she was mentoring his child. For a fleeting second, Richard thought fatigue was playing tricks on his mind. But the chalkboard didn't lie. The formulas were real, advanced calculus, maybe even higher, and so was her poise. Maria's calm, focused expression was not that of a servant following orders. It was the quiet determination of someone doing what she was born to do. He stood there frozen, half in disbelief, half in wonder. The chandelier's light shimmered across the whiteboard, the numbers glowing faintly under its warm reflection. He had never seen his son this absorbed before. Not during piano lessons. Not with tutors who charged more per hour than some families earned in a month. Maria's voice was soft but confident, each word deliberate. Like she was guiding Daniel through a secret world only they understood. Now remember, Daniel, she said, smiling as the boy scribbled notes with excitement. Mathematics is not about memorizing numbers. It's about seeing patterns, about understanding how the universe speaks. Her words struck Richard like thunder. He hadn't thought about math as a language of the universe since his Ivy League days, and he couldn't remember the last time he had taught his son anything meaningful. His life had been consumed by mergers, acquisitions, stock prices, and strategy meetings. The boy's life had been left to caretakers, tutors, and the occasional video call. But here, in this quiet room, Maria had given his son something priceless: curiosity. He stayed silent, watching. For the first time in years, the great Richard Grant didn't feel in control. He felt small, human. "Miss Maria," Daniel asked, his eyes sparkling, "does this mean I can solve problems that even adults can't?" Maria chuckled softly. "Yes, Daniel, you are capable of more than you know. All it takes is curiosity and courage." Courage. That word lingered like smoke in Richard's mind. He had faced hostile takeovers, financial crises, and cutthroat competition, yet he couldn't recall the last time he'd shown courage in his own home. He had built empires but had been too afraid to step into his son's world. He wanted to leave before anyone noticed him. But his feet wouldn't move. His heart, heavy with something he couldn't name, held him there. Then Maria turned. Her hand froze mid-air, the marker trembling slightly as her eyes met his. "Sir," she gasped, startled. I didn't expect you home so early." Daniel turned too, smiling brightly. "Dad, look!" "Miss Maria is teaching me math. Real math, like geniuses do." Richard forced a smile. His voice came out lower than he expected. "What's going on here?" Maria lowered her gaze, her confidence melting into nervous humility. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to overstep. Daniel was curious about some old notes I had, and I—" "Old notes?" Richard interrupted, frowning. Maria nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. I used to study engineering before." She hesitated. "Before life happened." Her voice broke slightly on the last words. And in that instant, something inside Richard shifted. He suddenly saw her, not as a maid, but as a woman who had once dreamed, studied, and strived. A woman who had brilliance buried under circumstance. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. The image of Maria writing those equations haunted him. The sound of her calm voice echoing lessons about patterns and courage refused to fade. For decades, he had believed power came from control. But now, he was beginning to suspect that real power came from inspiration, and that his wealth had blinded him from seeing it. In the days that followed, Richard found himself lingering outside the study, listening quietly as Maria continued to teach. He saw how she tailored her lessons to Daniel's interests, turning fractions into stories, geometry into art, numbers into puzzles. The boy, once restless and easily distracted, now sat still for hours lost in fascination. And Richard began to notice subtle things: Maria's patience when Daniel made a mistake, her ability to turn failure into a lesson, her laughter that made the mansion feel less empty. One evening, unable to hold back any longer, he approached her as she packed up her materials. "Maria," he began, "if you'd prefer to stop, I'll understand. You're not required to teach him. That's not part of your job." Maria hesitated, her expression unreadable. "Sir, I only wanted to help. Daniel has such a bright mind, and he reminds me—" She trailed off as if catching herself. "I'm sorry. I'll stop if you wish." But Richard shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "You've given my son something I never could." "Please, don't stop. In fact—" He paused, unsure how to continue. "Tell me more about you. About where you learned all this." Her eyes widened. No one had ever asked. Slowly, she told him her story, how she had once been a top student in her country studying engineering on scholarship, how her father's sudden death had left her family drowning in debt, how she had given up her education to support her younger siblings, eventually traveling overseas for work. Her voice trembled, but her eyes stayed strong. "It wasn't easy, sir, but I don't regret it. Life teaches in different ways, sometimes not in classrooms, but through people we meet." Richard sat there silently, humbled. He had spent his life surrounded by degrees, titles, and accolades, yet here was a woman with none of those things who had achieved something far greater: dignity without recognition, wisdom without reward. That night, Richard made a decision. He called his legal team, his financial advisors, and began drafting a plan to help Maria return to her studies, to give her a chance to fulfill the dreams she had once set aside. But when he told her, Maria declined. "Sir," she said softly, "I can't thank you enough, but right now my greatest joy is teaching Daniel. If I can help him see his potential, that will be enough for me." Her words pierced him deeper than any business loss ever could. For the first time, he understood what true wealth meant, not in numbers, but in impact. Weeks turned into months. Daniel blossomed, his confidence and empathy growing alongside his knowledge. Richard began spending more evenings at home, watching, learning, even participating. Sometimes he'd ask questions, pretending not to understand just to keep the conversation going. Slowly, father and son grew closer, but soon word spread. Some of Richard's board members, hearing rumors that his maid was teaching his son, began to whisper. "It's unprofessional," they said. "A billionaire's heir being tutored by domestic staff? What will people think?" Social media picked it up. Tabloids mocked the situation with sensational headlines. "Billionaire's maid becomes his son's teacher. Has the family lost its mind?" Reputation had always been Richard's fortress. But now the old fortress no longer mattered. He saw how Daniel's eyes lit up when he solved a new problem, how Maria's presence had brought life back into their home. "Let the world talk," he thought. "They don't see what I see." Yet the storm didn't pass easily. Investors grew nervous. Some hinted at pulling out of partnerships, fearing bad publicity. Even Daniel's elite school principal called, suggesting he hire a qualified professional. Every word was an insult wrapped in politeness. That evening, Richard sat alone in his study, staring at the flickering fireplace. The old version of him, the man of control and calculation, would have fired Maria immediately just to protect his image. But that man was gone. In his place stood a father who had finally remembered how to care. The next day, he gathered his board. "If any of you believe my son's education or my home is up for public debate," he said calmly, "you're free to leave this company." His tone was even, but his eyes were unshakable. Not a single man spoke. Still, fate had another test waiting. One evening, Richard found Maria sitting alone in the kitchen, her eyes red, her hands trembling. "Maria," he said softly. She quickly wiped her tears, forcing a smile. "It's nothing, sir." "Please," he urged. "Tell me." After a long pause, she whispered, "I received a letter. My mother is very ill. I need to go home." The words hit Richard like a blade. He had come to depend on her, not just for Daniel's growth, but for the warmth she had brought into their lives. But he saw the anguish in her eyes, the guilt of being far from her family. "I'll help," he said immediately. "Whatever it takes, medical care, travel, expenses. Just say the word." But Maria shook her head. "You've already done so much. I can't take more. I just need to be there." Richard leaned closer, his voice gentle. "This isn't charity, Maria. This is gratitude. Let me do this, not as your employer, but as someone who finally understands what it means to care." For a long moment, Maria said nothing. Then tears rolled down her cheeks. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, "for seeing me." Within days, Richard arranged everything. His private jet flew Maria home, along with doctors and supplies for her mother's care. But he didn't stop there. Weeks later, he visited her village himself. What he found humbled him. The poverty, the simplicity, the quiet resilience of people who lived with little but gave much. Children ran barefoot through dusty roads, their laughter echoing through broken walls. And in the center of it all was Maria, guiding them, teaching them, inspiring them. It was there that Richard's greatest idea was born. "Maria," he said one morning as they watched the children learn under a mango tree, "let's build something here. Something that lasts. A school, a foundation. You'll lead it." Maria's eyes widened. "Sir, I wouldn't know how." "You already do," Richard replied. "You've been doing it all along." And so began the project that would define the rest of his life, a foundation dedicated to education in underserved communities, led by Maria herself. She was no longer a maid. She was a mentor, a director, a visionary. When she finally returned months later, Daniel ran into her arms, crying tears of joy. "I thought you weren't coming back," he whispered. Maria smiled, brushing his hair gently. "I promised I'd never stop teaching you, didn't I?" Lessons resumed, but they weren't confined to the study anymore. Sometimes they took place in the garden, sometimes under the open sky where Maria taught Daniel about the geometry of tree branches or the physics of a bird's flight. Richard often joined them, not as a businessman, but as a father rediscovering wonder. Slowly, the world began to take notice. The same media that once mocked him now celebrated his transformation. Investors who doubted him now respected him more. But Richard no longer cared for headlines or approval. All that mattered was Daniel's laughter, Maria's peace, and the countless lives their foundation began to touch. Years passed. Daniel grew into a brilliant young man filled with compassion and humility, his curiosity as alive as ever. And Richard, now older, would often think back to that one evening, the night he came home early and saw his maid writing equations on a whiteboard. That was the night his entire life changed. When people later asked him what his greatest investment had been, Richard Grant would smile and answer, "It wasn't a company. It wasn't a building. It was a woman who reminded me that true wealth lies in lifting others." And as the camera faded on that memory, the mansion that once echoed with silence now rang with laughter, learning, and life, the beautiful sound of a second chance finally fulfilled. Before we end, if this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to FableBox. Stories like this remind us that greatness doesn't always wear a suit or sit in a corner office. Sometimes it wears an apron and carries a heart full of courage. And if Maria's journey inspired you, comment the word INSPIRE below. Let's fill the world with gratitude and hope, one story at a time.